Okay, so firstly, thank you very much to Ursula and Alexandra and Gabriella for the invitation. It's really, really nice, and I've really enjoyed the papers we've heard so far, and I think there's a lot of synergies between what we're all talking about, and we're maybe approaching them from slightly different ways, and obviously some different time periods. So my work is going to focus very much on historic Ireland. So there'll be some reference to kind of early medieval all the way through up to post-medieval. And I decided I would focus on emotions. So I thought I would sort of delve a little bit into, what actually are emotions firstly. So it's really interesting when you start to read about, emotions, because they're causing quite a lot of turmoil within the psychological world. People are always trying to sort of move the work from being subjective into being, more categorized. So you've got, for example, Plutchik's Wheel of Emotions, and it has 8 core emotions. So that's quite an old study, from the 1980s. More recently then, there was a paper in PNAS in 2017, and it was by psychologists Cohen and Keltner, and they talk about 27 emotions. So I found this study very interesting because they showed little videos, they had lots of participants involved, they use all these fancy mathematical models, and at the end they distilled the emotions down into 27 distinct emotions. And they said, yes, there is, there's gradients of interconnected emotions, as we can see in the Plutchik kind of model. But I thought this was very interesting because, the science of emotion, it sort of has this concept that emotions are focused on subjective experiences that people represent with language, and that's why, that people can have different words for different sort of experiences. So these experiences are represented within a semantic space that includes hundreds to thousands of semantic terms that relate to a rich variety of emotional states. So hence, that's why I found this Cohen and Kettner article very useful and very helpful to try to make sense of what we're dealing with. So, bringing emotions into our archaeological interpretations, it's not something new. We have archaeologists like Sarah Tarlow has made like an amazing contribution to this space, and it was back in 2000, which is like 25 years ago. She wrote, a really groundbreaking paper in current anthropology, and she was, looking at emotion in archaeology, and it's really interesting how she was approaching emotion, in terms of looking at the emotions of people in the past, and then, the impact of our experiences in everyday life, on our work as archaeologists. So there was different sorts of strands, and, in the comments to that paper, some people really liked what she was doing and saw it as a great step forward, but there was some resistance as well. So I thought that was very interesting. And then more recently, she did a paper, again, like 2012, so it's quite a while ago, and she sort of tried to push the story forward. And one of the things that she said is just in her abstract, finally, it's argued that it's vitally important for us to incorporate a consideration of emotional values and understandings into our archaeologies, but that emotion cannot be separated from other aspects of social and cultural meaning and experience. And I suppose this is something I think it's really important. When I was listening to Katarina's talk, with the early Bronze Age prehistoric populations, I can see a lot of parallels with what I'm seeing in the medieval Irish populations. But again, they're very different contexts, different time periods, different geographical places. So are they real? Or is it, that we just need to be a bit more careful about our sort of social sort of constructs, if you like? So in terms of kind of scholarship on emotion, this is, just as Rebecca showed, like the archaeology of childhood and the mother-infant nexus, there's been huge advances in recent years. And I think this is also the same with archaeology and emotion. And I've just picked out a few examples of books. I didn't look at articles, but books that I thought, were really pushing the story forward. So this Archaeologies of the Heart, it's a lovely book, and it's very much bringing indigenous archaeologies in the Americas to the fore, and you know, when you read those stories, those archaeologists do bring their lived experiences to the story, and they see that as a very kind of valid way forward. But again, you know, some people don't agree with that, but I tend to think it's inevitable that what we've experienced in our lives is going to impact on, you know, our work and how we deal with people in the past and how we understand, you know, their experiences. We've got things like the archaeology of anxiety, so it's not all positive emotions. You know, some people are looking at quite negative emotions. Archaeologies of attachment. And Sanna Lipkin, she's been doing some amazing work in Finland, you know, looking at sort of, again, sort of infant burials and textiles, and, you know, how we can kind of, you know, see the emotional connections between families and their dead children. And then this has sort of resulted in this archaeology of attachment book. And then this was another book that I thought really was pushing things forward. It's this Routledge Handbook of Sensory Archaeology. And one of the papers in this, I think it's Ruth Nugent, you know, she talks about emotion and the senses in archaeology, and the sensitivity of the human body is used to trace the sensitivity of the intangible emotions within the body. So everything is interconnected, and it's kind of how can we as archaeologists, you know, address things like this, you know, but keeping our scientific hats on, but also sort of bringing in these kind of aspects of life and emotion, which we know are very important to us, you know, in the modern world. And I think in terms of emotion, like, it fits very well into a post-processual framework because it's all about past human experiences. And I think then, you know, when you bring children into it, you know, as Katerina said, we're really moving into the realm of sort of gender and feminist archaeologies, and we're kind of combining all these different approaches. So in terms of my sort of experience, you know, my first considerations of the archaeology of emotion, it was when I was dealing with post-medieval children's burial grounds in Ireland. So it kind of combined my interest in children, but then also my interest in atypical burial practices. So we have about 1,700 of these Killini sites across Ireland, and they're basically exclusionary cemeteries, if you like, because they are unconsecrated burial grounds, and radiocarbon dating is showing that they largely date to the post-medieval period. So Castle Cara is one example, and it obviously is like a little castle, but then inside that there were the remains of about 21 little babies, and they were from a much later era. So this kind of, it all goes back to St. Augustine of Hippo. And back in the 4th, 5th century, he sort of was agonising about, you know, original sin and the importance of baptism. And he then decreed that really anyone unbaptised, they're destined for hell, even if it's not their fault. And this is something we get lots of kind of signs of this across Europe, any sort of Christian country. But in Ireland, in the 16th, 17th century, our church seemed to have undergone like a real sort of, it became very hard line. And this seems to have been in the wake of the Counter-Reformation when canon law was being reaffirmed. So we had young Irish priests, mostly sort of Franciscans. They went off to Louvain College, and basically they were taught in the ways of St. Augustine. So you've got here Father Flary O'Mulconry, who, and you can see in the background there's a picture of St. Augustine, and basically these young men were being sort of taught exactly, you know, St. Augustine's teachings. So they came back to Ireland with these really sort of hardline views, and this seems to be then when we start to get these children's burial grounds. So that's kind of just a little bit of background about those. But in terms of emotion, I suppose like when I was looking at these, it was around about the time I had my first child and my daughter was born. And it just struck me one day that this was just a really horrific thing that was happening to these people, because not only had they lost their baby, then they couldn't even be sort of have this comfort that the child was going to go to heaven, that, you know, they had this idea that the child was going to go to hell, or in a slightly softer version, the child was going to go to limbo. And this is where you get this kind of concept of disenfranchised grief, and this is something that Kenneth Doka has written about quite a lot, and it's basically the idea that what was lost was considered to be of no worth or no value to other people. So I kind of was looking into this and kind of with my lens as a mother thinking this is awful. And then I started to look a bit more closely at the funerary record. And, you know, to me, it's basically the only big difference is that the burials are not in consecrated graveyards. They're not in the blessed graveyards where most people would be buried. But whenever you look at the funerary rites afforded to the people, they're pretty much the same. You know, like the ordinary members of society, they would have had, you know, like little anonymous cross markers or field stones, you know, even in consecrated grounds. They'd have had the same funerary goods. You know, we've got examples of Killini that have been excavated where the babies are being buried like with a little doll or with dice, you know, little bone dice. Or they've got, you know, quite elaborate stone settings. So what I think was happening was that we're seeing like a plurality of narratives. So the church, which was the dominant kind of system, basically was saying these children are nothing, that, you know, they're not baptised, so they're outside our community. But the families were not viewing them in this way. They had this disenfranchised grief and basically were, you know, treating the infants, trying to get them buried, you know, in old ecclesiastical sites or with little toys. And you can see, you know, grief in these graves. So that was kind of my first sort of foray into emotion. And then I sort of started wondering about medieval burial grounds and can we see evidence of emotion? You know, like we all know from modern graveyards that, you know, they're charged with emotion and there's a lot of loss and sorrow. So I wanted to, you know, look at what was happening in the kind of archaeological record for, you know, the medieval. So I looked at burial practices for a site up in the north of Ireland, Ballyhannah, and I focused on children whose remains were, you know, very, very complete, and who showed sort of signs of, you know, like clear funerary practices. And about a quarter of the children in this site, they displayed what we could say is one or more atypical funerary characteristics. Now, the historical sources indicate that it's really sort of the family and women that would have been responsible for burying the dead. You know, they would have, you know, washed the bodies, wrapped individuals up in shrouds, and, you know, been very, very much involved in the sort of pre-burial aspect. So I kind of started to notice there were things like little bits of pottery, maybe little bits of hammer slag, metal beads in these burials. And to be honest, they were quite often overlooked by the archaeologists excavating, and it's only really when you start looking through the archives and looking at the photographs that these objects jump out. And there was very sort of particular placement of such objects, you know, at the head, maybe at the hips, maybe at the feet. So to me, it looked like there was something deliberate going on. And again, just from my own lived experience, like I was at a funeral of a relative quite recently, and their grandchildren were putting little tokens into the coffin, you know, like little letters and, you know, just little bits of jewellery, and like her uniform went in. So I think these have meaning again, and I think, you know, it's again sort of showing us about care and tenderness and emotional attachments. And, you know, we all appreciate that we only see part of the sort of objects that go into graves because, you know, we don't see a lot of the organic remains like flowers and different things. So I kind of thought, you know, when we're dealing with children, they're going to have had friends, they're going to have had siblings, you know, maybe these were little tokens, little charms that they put into the burials as well. So that was something. And then I also noticed that quite a lot of the younger children were buried in an atypical position. So for this era, people would be expected to be buried, you know, in an extended supine position with their head to the west. But a lot of the children, they were orientated in that way, but their remains were a little bit more casually positioned, you know, like flexed on their sides, and sometimes they had pillow stones. So it looked like a more sort of natural repose. So again, I think these are very subtle, but they are suggesting, you know, care, tenderness, and emotional attachments. So that's kind of where I've sort of come into this archaeology of emotion. Okay, so back to the sort of Cohen and Keltner 27 emotions. So like I said, psychologists are trying to make better sense of emotions and their definitions, and I wanted to try to use this approach in an archaeological context. So I'm going to now focus on one Irish burial ground that I've been involved in studying quite recently. So it's the site of Ranelagh. It's in County Roscommon, so that's in the sort of Midlands of Ireland, just here. It was one of these sites that it was discovered through a road scheme. It's really huge, but it had been forgotten to memory. So you can see it's got, you know, a series of large sort of enclosures and ditches, and it seems to have started off as a small sort of family enclosure and then grown into a place of importance and assembly over time. And it's called a settlement cemetery because we've got lots of evidence, you know, that people were living there, and lots of evidence for industrial activities, but there was a large graveyard as well. In terms of scale, there was about 600 people, give or take, 191 babies under a year, then 196 children, sort of between 1 and 18. Now, these are sort of like, they're more, I would say, pre-adults, because, again, our Irish historical sources tend to suggest that people were probably, you know, they moved into adulthood around either 14 or 17. So I'm just kind of looking at biologically immature. And then we had another third adults. So, yeah, and the main burial phase was about AD 600 to 1150, so it was used over quite a long period of time. So what I'm going to do now, it's I'm a lot less outward looking than the previous speakers. I'm going to focus in now, and we're going to look at sort of osteobiographies, if you like, of particular individuals, because I just want to show the sort of the range of emotions that we might find, you know, just within one burial ground, you know, and related to children. Okay, so the majority of both adults and then pre-adults, if you like, you know, they are buried in a typical sort of Christian position, you know, with the head to the west, the limbs extended, and they're lying on their back. So that was about, you know, 80% or plus. We also saw sort of a very similar trend to what happened at Ballyhannah, you know, where you've got the young children in these kind of more restful sort of positions, you know, lying on their sides. Sometimes you've got extra little things in their graves, like this is a little neonate with earmuff stones. And then, you know, you've got other children with lumps of quartz. So there's one really obvious piece of quartz. So in terms of the definitions, I think we can see lots of evidence for care in the sort of typical and then also the atypical burials. So if we use the definitions that I talked about, you know, these could be sort of emotions of adoration and sadness. So that's kind of the sort of the general, but now if we focus in on some more unusual burials, you can see kind of additional sort of emotions. So there were two cases where you had very young babies of the same sort of age who were potentially twins at Ranelagh. Now one set were in very poor condition, so it wasn't really possible to say much about their positioning. But this pair here, you can see basically that they were sort of lay beside each other. So it's kind of trying to read the burial, if you like. And you can see that both sets of their lower legs are in this kind of unusual sort of cross-legged position. And you can see that they're buried very tightly against one another. So their arms are sort of right beside each other. So that's a really good indicator that this would have been a simultaneous burial. And these babies were both about 38 gestational weeks. Now, what was really interesting was that you can actually see that the hands are the arms are directly parallel, and the hands look like they're either overlapped or potentially even entwined. So there's the little phalanges of skeleton 453, and then you can see sort of underneath 455's little phalanges are there too. So this looks like we've got potentially twins, but certainly two little babies buried parallel to each other. And potentially their hands overlapped or entwined. So it could be, you know, that the families of these individuals, you know, they wanted their babies to be, you know, together in the afterlife. So I think there's almost like a layer of additional kind of care and concern in this burial. So you've got our sort of adoration or sadness, but then potentially sort of anxiety and craving, you know, that the two will be together in the afterlife. So it's in these sort of double burials, I think sometimes we can find very heightened evidence of emotion. So just to show you sort of other examples where we've got, you know, children, but this time of quite different age. So over on the left, we've got skeleton 99, who is a little 1.5-year-old child, and you can see that they're buried on top of an older child who's between sort of 7.5 and 9.5. Now, there is some disturbance in this burial, but again, you know, using archaeothanatological approaches, you can see that there's very much a straight line, you know, at the upper arm of the older child and at the skull of skeleton 99. So this gives us an indication that these two were buried together, wrapped in the same shroud. So Just another example, I'll return to that one in a minute. We've got skeleton 347, who was a young adult female, and on top you can see skeleton 348. So we got some DNA work undertaken on unusual graves, and we're hoping to expand this now into sort of full genome analysis of most of the individuals from the site. So hopefully we'll be getting the same sort of data that Katerina has for her populations. But in terms of these two individuals, you can see that the little infant, you can see the bones are very well contained together. So it looks like the infant was shrouded individually, and then the adult was shrouded separately, but they're both, the infant is buried within the space of the adult body. Now, in terms of DNA, we know that the little baby was a male, and we sort of assumed it was going to be a mother and her baby, but actually the DNA showed us that they weren't related at all. So, in terms of this atypical treatment, you know, we can say we've again got our sort of adoration, sadness, and craving, but then, you know, we sort of have to ask ourselves as well, you know, the fact that these pairs are wrapped together or put into the same grave together, you know, is there maybe a practical element? You know, are these people who just died at the same time and sort of, rather than bury the younger children separately, they put them in, you know, with somebody else? So is there maybe a degree of convenience and practicality, you know, which is still very respectful, but this is potentially where we can maybe bring in sort of calmness as well, if you like. Okay, so there were also then two very poignant double burials of children. So with this time we've got skeleton 55, which is to the left. So it's a little boy, about 2.5 to 3 years. And then to the right we've got a little girl who's about 7.5 to 9.5 years. We got one of our colleagues did a reconstruction of the burial, and the colouring that's used for these two children is based on what their DNA profiles showed us. Now, in terms of DNA, it showed that they were 4th degree relatives, so possibly first cousins once removed. But it's the way that they're positioned, you know, I think it's again very poignant. And when you, thankfully, the archaeologists involved in the excavation, you know, they took fantastic photographs as they excavated the burial. But you can see that the little girl, her arm actually goes sort of across her neck and then sort of round the back of the little boy, and her hand is on his shoulder. So it's really, you know, it's an emotive position where it looks like she's actually hugging the child. Other things that are sort of, again, emotive, and it's a bit like, again, Katerina's burial, where you've got like the little girl's forehead touching the little boy's head. Their heads are level, you know, so you can see it's a very particularly laid out individual. So I think in this case, you know, maybe the little girl was, you know, the families thought that she could be charged with looking after the little boy in the afterlife. And, you know, if the parents were cousins, they could have had a really close relationship in life, and then this is translated into this burial. So again, going back to our terms, you know, we can talk about adoration, sadness, anxiety, maybe aesthetic appreciation because they have been laid out in such a sort of a beautiful manner, empathetic pain, you know, between the relatives that are left behind, and maybe nostalgia, you know, because of maybe their connections and sort of their hopes and, you know, what they'd hope for their children in the future. So I think it's a very powerful combination in terms of emotions. Now, we had another double burial, and on the excavation, it was assumed that this was two females, but it actually turns out it was an adolescent boy and a young man. So this is what our DNA showed us. So again, you can see like there's almost like a full body sort of hugging, and the younger man's arm is touching the top of the younger boy's arm is touching the top of the older man. So again, it's really packed with emotion. Now, in Ireland, we know that there was a big practice of fosterage, so people would have been biologically connected, but there was a lot of social kinship. So these guys were first cousins, but maybe they were foster brothers as well, and maybe they were just very close in life, and we know that foster brothers shared a bed and shared a cup and had all this. But I think the fact that they're laid out together in this way also then potentially brings in an element of sort of romance and sexual desire, which are more of the emotions from the 2017 paper. A couple of adolescents, just sort of sticking with the older children for a minute, they were buried with quite unusual, sort of in a position or with grave goods. So you can see here we've got a 12.5 to 14.5-year-old female, and there's this piece of antler on her pelvis. And this is something that we've got other examples in Irish contexts, and it seems, again from historical sources, that antler might be a symbol of fertility and regeneration. And we've got, again, another female adolescent, and her body was just riddled with evidence of tuberculosis. So she'd have had this chronically throughout her life. But you can see she's buried almost in a praying position, with her hands up right in front of her chin. So again, I think we've got sort of extra emotions in here, adoration, sadness, again, potentially anxiety for them in the afterlife, empathetic pain, and then maybe craving this idea that they'll be reborn, in another life. So those are very positive. The last two examples I'm going to talk about are sort of negative. And this is the only burial on the site that I would potentially say is a deviant burial. So we've got a very young adolescent or young adult pregnant woman and a near full-term fetus. She was buried in the ditch of the site, and you can see again using sort of archaeothanatology, you can see her ribs are very splayed out, her arms are in a casual position, and it just looks like she was partly covered, but a lot of her bones were just, her body was left exposed. So we get a sense that it's a very kind of casual, hasty burial, and that her remains had sort of decomposed in a partially open space. So now I think we're looking at things like maybe anger and disgust. Maybe this woman had done something during life and people were happy that she got a bad death. So maybe there was a degree of satisfaction. And maybe there was fear for who she was in life, and that's why she was put into a ditch. So you've got sort of anxiety and fear. So again, kind of different types of emotions. And then the last example I want to talk about is one that really shocked us when we were doing the analysis of these people. It was a male child, about 7.5 to 9.5, and there was clear evidence of decapitation in his remains. So you can see the cuts on his mandible and then on his upper vertebrae. So he had, clearly died a very violent death. So maybe we're looking at anger, disgust, and maybe an element of satisfaction. Now, again, from the historical sources, we know it would have been a serious offence to kill a child of this age, and whoever did it would have potentially had, been killed themselves or had to pay a lot of money to the family. But we also know that there would have been hostage agreements, and quite often the children of rivals were taken hostage, and they were looked after really well unless things went wrong and the adults sort of transgressed the agreement, and then they would be killed. So this is a potential interpretation for why this child was executed. And then you can see as well, he's buried in anatomical order. He had little grave goods with him, a little bit of bracelet, piece of quartz, piece of worked animal bones. So in addition to the negative emotions, we're also seeing, adoration, sadness, and perhaps a degree of horror on the part of the family, because they put these extra grave goods in with him when you wouldn't necessarily expect very many grave goods. And there's also a flat stone, which seems to have been a deliberate inclusion in the grave, and we see this in some of the adult burials as well. So maybe this was this idea of kind of pinning him down in his grave, and a level of sort of anxiety and fear that because of his untimely death, he'd maybe come back and haunt the living or cause something negative to happen to the community. So this is a kind of an example where we've got real mixed emotions coming forward. So it was very sort of focused in on emotions and on one large burial ground, but I hope I've kind of showed you how if we read the burials, we can get a deeper understanding of the diversity of ways in which individuals could react, when dealing with the death of a child, and sometimes it was seen as a particularly tragic loss, but then maybe we've got examples where the death wasn't seen as particularly important. And I just think, again, it's a way to connect with people of the past and just to remind us of their humanity. And I think it's a worthwhile thing to do, alongside our sort of scientific assessments of these people. So that's it.